Friends and enemies, ladies and gentlemen, everybody in between, on a day where everybody seems to be protesting in Canada. Just want to welcome you to another edition of the Canadian Bitcoiners podcast, where we'll be talking about stuff all related with Bitcoin, not with stuff that is controversial in the world. And before I bring on the man of the hour, Bob Burnett, I just want to rhyme off a couple of things. Well, I have to do it. We have a couple of sponsors of the show. Number one sponsor is EasyDNS, and check them out if you have or want to have a website hosted with a reputable company, because let's be honest, there's a lot of shady characters in this field, but EasyDNS has been around for a long time, a heck of a long time, since 1998. A lot of other companies have come and gone because they haven't been able to provide a level of service that is satisfactory to customers. Yet EasyDNS, they keep chugging along. So check them out if you want to either start a website with them or migrate your existing website, and they could do that. Not only that, you could also do email hosting. You could move your email over, so you could move your dirty Gmail stuff over to them and have it hosted. And you can have your own special domain name if you wanted to, if you want to use their DNS domain name services over there. So a lot of different options you have with EasyDNS. They're private, they're secure. We like Mark. Mark has been on the show. He's the owner of the company, and he is obviously privacy oriented. And you can pay with your Bitcoin if you really wanted to, but who wants to pay with Bitcoin these days, especially with the depressed price of Bitcoin? Oh, shut up. If they thought it was going to be showing on my block clock, it was not. Nonetheless, check them out. We like them. We use them for our website because there's no better place to use for web hosting and other services along those lines. We have a second sponsor, and of course, that is Bold Bitcoin. They're rapidly expanding around the globe. Just this past week, they announced that they're expanding into Costa Rica, and it's a good place to buy your Bitcoin. You could sell it if you wanted to. Again, why would you want to? But you can with Bold Bitcoin. You can live on a Bitcoin standard with Bold. You could pay your bills with Bold Bitcoin. You could buy gift cards with your Bitcoin and then spend that in the real world. They could live under the Bitcoin standard, just like Satoshi wanted you to do. You could buy Liquid, you could buy Lightning, you could buy on-chain, a lot of different options. But the best of all, that at least I think, is the kyc-free, where you just simply go to a Canada Post, 6,000 locations in Canada, exchange your dirty fiat, and you could buy some kyc-free Bitcoin thanks to Bull Bitcoin. Check them out. Our referral code is below. If you haven't already signed up with them, please use it. With doing that and funding your account, you're going to get 21 bucks added, no questions asked. Now, that's all done. The formalities are out of the way. I want to bring in the man of the hour, Bob Burnett, just fresh off a run in the great state, and I would imagine very warm state of Florida. Bob, how are you?
Great, Len. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I appreciate you coming on. This is going to be a great discussion about a few different things because, well, we'll talk about it in a moment because I'm looking at the mempool, I'm looking at a few different things, and I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart. But before we go into it, maybe you could just enlighten our audience. Who the heck is Bob Burnett?
Well, he's an old guy that's been doing things like this for a long time. So I guess the pertinent part of my story would go back to really the late 70s, which I know is probably before almost anybody listening is born. But my background started in computing. I started out coding in high school in the late 70s. That led to me studying computer engineering in the early 80s, which was not a very common thing to do at that time. And I was very blessed to be part of, sitting at that cusp of when computing went from centralized to decentralized. So a lot of people might not think about that, but I think Bitcoiners can now relate to that, we're not the first thing to go through decentralization. Computing was a highly centralized thing. And when in the late 70s and prior to that, everything was mainframe and mini computers. People sat on terminals, all that sort of stuff. And so I was blessed to kind of enter right at the cusp of the personal computer. And that changed the computing from a central point to an edge point. When I got out of school, I went to work for a company called Zenith, which at the time was one of the largest TV makers in the world, but they had a personal computer division. I was blessed to have been assigned by pure luck to a team designing what became known as the Zenith Super Sport, which I would contend is the world's first laptop computer. And that was a really cool thing when I look back. In fact, I was on eBay today because I'm actually trying to buy one of those. You can still buy one.
What's the price of them going for these days? Just curious.
About $100 to $150.
In comparison to back in the day, what was it brand new, if you recall?
$4,000.
And that was in, I guess, late 80s dollars, mid 80s dollars.
Well, that would have been like a $1987, $1986. Yeah. So, the equivalent of what, 7,500 or something like that.
Yeah. So,
but now, obviously, it has no useful value as a computer. It's purely nostalgic. Like this one I was looking at, fascinating, is in the original box. The guy still has the original box in pristine condition. So
with the styrofoam and everything along with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are, I do enjoy going down this path of nostalgia, looking at older equipment. And when people have them packed away with the original styrofoam and everything and manuals, it's quite interesting to see how they cared for it for decades and still it's around. But yeah, man, I hope you get it. Hope you land it.
I hope so too. Yeah, please, anybody listening, don't go outbid me on eBay.
So you're not just like an old equipment and old engineer that's been around for a long time. You've been involved in the Bitcoin, and I don't want to say the word crypto, but you have been dabbling with Ethereum mining back in the day, from what I recall. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I guess
no longer you do that, by the way. Obviously, nobody's doing it these days. But you gave up that some time ago, and you are a Bitcoiner, of course.
Yeah, to transition from in 1986. So eventually, I started my own company designing laptops with a couple other guys. We were purchased by a company called Gateway.
Yeah.
And so I joined Gateway. I was part of the management team that helped take them public in the early 90s. I just had a phenomenal ride with Gateway, became the chief technology officer there. It was a wonderful ride. I was, for a different project I'm working on right now, I just went and looked up some stats. And, we had, at our peak, we achieved $9 billion in revenue. We had $1 billion in profit annually. We had 25,000 employees. We had locations all over the world. I mean, we were a big company.
This was the late 90s?
This would have been 2000, 2001 would have been the peak of revenue. But yeah. Which, by the way, to put that in context, I think sometimes in the Bitcoin world, we don't realize how small Bitcoin is at this point. So, for instance, Gateway, one company, which would have been maybe like the 5th biggest personal computer maker in the world in that era of the late 90s, in dollars of the 1990s, was $9 billion in revenue. Well, this year in 2023, the entire mining community will have $9 billion in revenue. So Gateway's revenue is, as one personal computer company, was equivalent to the entire mining revenue of our entire industry, right? All the pubcos, all the privates, everybody together is $9 billion.
And that $9 billion is taking into consideration today's reward, which is going to be halved in 7 months ish, give or take.
Correct. So, yeah. So we'll see. I do a lot of this sort of math, and we can come back to the question you asked. But since we're on it, my prediction is roughly April 20th. I have my own models about when things will happen. Most people's halving date is somewhere in that range, right? So that would give us about 110 days next year, roughly, of 6.25 for the subsidy, and then the remaining days, what would that be? 255 or something like that at 3.25. So the blended average next year is going to be 4.07. So
okay,
anybody wants to know that, a random piece of trivia that only somebody in the mining business really cares about. But 4.07 is the average amount of Bitcoin per block next year.
That's the estimated, because we're basing it on an April 20th halving date.
But it really won't change much. I mean, I might, if I'm off by a few days, it won't change 4.07 by very much. And then we'll probably talk about this later, but just to complete the thought, interesting little fact is that in the history of Bitcoin, going all the way back to the Genesis block through, at least through August, the average fees per block is 0.335. And interestingly, the last 6 months, the average fees per block is 0.335. Like to the 1,000th place, the last 6 months is the same as the all-time. So remarkably consistent. Although if you look at it then and you say, well, what's the percentage of miner revenue from fees? Of course, because of the halvings, fees haven't really changed, but the subsidy has. Therefore, you know, we are seeing that, and I think they're gonna rip. We'll probably talk about that later. Back to your question about Ethereum. So I left that industry in the mid 2000s, but got back in, I like to say, through the back door, because in 2017 I got a phone call from somebody who was trying to set up an Ethereum mining farm and could not find a professionally designed Ethereum mining rig. And so they called me up and asked me if I would be interested in designing and manufacturing those rigs for him. I ended up doing that. We supplied that contract and then said, well, we got this design. Let's see if anybody else wants to buy it. And at the time, it was a popular thing. I was looking at it as a computer guy, though, even though I hadn't taken the time. You know, of course, I kicked myself like everybody. I hadn't taken the time till then. And then as we rolled into 2018, in addition to my technical degree, I have a background in economics as well. I have a degree in economics, and I had studied Austrian economics going back to 2001. And I realized I didn't like Ethereum, that it had warts, it had too much technical complexity, it had governance issues, it had, you know, all the things that we don't have to bore into here. But and then I saw that Bitcoin was different, that it had what I believed in technically. It aligned with me philosophically, and you know, we pivoted the company that direction.
And the company being Barefoot Mining.
Barefoot Mining, yes, Barefoot Mining, correct.
And so right now, what is Barefoot Mining doing? What are you providing your customers?
Okay, so we really do two things. Our primary thing is, what we'll do is we will find an energy source. Could be, well, it could be, we find an energy source that has reliable energy at a good price. And it could be any size. It could be a couple hundred kilowatts. It could be a couple megawatts. That's the size range that we really like. And we can talk about why we like that size better than we like big sizes. But we special, and I call that horse class mining, by the way. Horse class is what I call it. And what we'll do is we'll find that energy source. We'll lock in the agreement for that energy, whether that's on grid or off grid, although I like to use terms captive and wild. We can talk about that a little more too. Then I'll put together a business plan around it. Depending on our financial position, we may fund it all ourselves, but typically what we're doing these days is we'll fund a little of it and we'll bring in investors to fund the rest. So we'll create a unique entity around that site and bring in a partner. The most recent one, at least that I can publicly talk about, we did with the Bitcoin Opportunity Fund, which is some of you may be familiar with, but it's a group of some of my friends, James Lavish, Larry Lepard, Greg Foss, David Foley, Mark Moss, that group of guys. Some of us, you'll see a lot of the older, maybe some of the older people in the Bitcoin space, but they run a great fund. So we did a project together. They brought most of the capital. We operate it. We share ownership in the organization, and that's where we go. So our vision, going back to kind of this horses thing, is if we look at the mining landscape, I divide every mining operation broadly into one of three buckets. One bucket is the elephants. That would be a big riot site, a marathon site, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts. And I call them elephants because they are big and powerful, but they're often very slow to grow. It takes a long time to get one up. So from the point of making a decision to do something to actually hashing, you're probably talking well over a year. So that's a hard thing because so much changes in that in our world, right? And I also say, the other problem with elephants is they're easy to hunt. They're hard to move and they're easy to hunt. Mm-hmm. So if you, again, we could dive down this hole if you would like later, but we are fighting for something with Bitcoin. We're fighting for control of the monetary system of the world, and it won't be without battles. We don't know what those battles are. They are going to be regulatory, though. There's going to be taxes. There's going to be community issues. I predict we will see things like eco-terrorism, where people feel emboldened and obligated to go blow shit up. And I think the elephants are the likely spots. Mm-hmm. Now, the other end of the spectrum I call are the rabbits, and that might be a home miner who has an S9 in his garage, or an accountant that throws 2 S19s in his server room with his QuickBooks server. And I call them rabbits because individually they're not very powerful, but collectively they can actually do some damage. If you start hunting rabbits, they'll scatter and you'll never hunt them all, right? They're almost, it'd be impossible to ever kill all the rabbits, right? The horses are the medium-sized, small to medium-sized commercial miners. Maybe a few hundred kilowatt operation to several megawatts. They are projects that we can put up really quickly. They are still powerful individually. We build all of ours in a mobile fashion, right? They're all container based. We can get them down and operating quickly, and if there's a threat, we can pick them up and move them quickly. So kind of like a horse. And then what I'll do is, so we have rabbits and horses and elephants. And then I use the terms captive and wild, which I'm a little different than most people, and I'm being a little subtle here. But what I like to say is that if you're captive, so you could be a captive elephant. So a captive elephant is a very large site that's completely dependent on a third party to provide the power. And without the consent and delivery from the third party, they have nothing. So they're captive, right? And they're not self-sovereign, right? So we talk as Bitcoiners about being sovereign. You don't see a lot of wild rabbits, although there's a few of them out there. People that do small little solar solutions or a little windmill or something like that. But a captive rabbit is still hard to find. In the horse category, we can do a lot of cool stuff on either the wild side or the captive side. So, but my favorite thing, what I'm really passionate about, are wild horses. And that could be, like, I'll give you an example of one of the things we've done, but some of you may be familiar with like what Gridless is doing in Africa as an example. They're doing a bunch of wild horses. What we've done is we found a couple years ago, we were looking for alternative power sources, and we found an old textile mill in South Carolina. The mill had been built in 1888. It originally had a water wheel that drove a series of looms, pre-electricity, to create all the fabrics there. Then in the early 1920s, they electrified it. And then, but unfortunately, so and they sat on the banks of the Enoree River in South Carolina and generated their own power for this facility. Well, like a lot of textile mills in the eastern seaboard of the US, they went out of business in 2000. And it sat dormant for 20 years. It literally got very rusty and dilapidated and all that. But the dam was still in place. It was structurally sound. Some of the bones of this thing were still okay. So we acquired the rights to the facility, and we put a fair amount of money into it, but we've rebuilt the entire hydroelectric infrastructure there, and we have a wild horse that mines there in South Carolina. And it gives me a certain degree of comfort because, of course, if the National Guard shows up and points a gun to our site manager there and says, turn it off, we'll turn it off. But that's about what it would take to shut us down. And there's a certain degree of comfort in that. And I believe as we go forward as an industry, that it's important that a large part of our infrastructure be horses, especially wild horses. Back in when the China mining ban happened, I think a lot of people in the Bitcoin community took comfort in the fact that, hey, we lost somewhere on the order of 60% of the hash. And I think most people would say, hey, we just cruised on through that, right? But it caused a thought exercise for me, and I'm kind of big on this. Maybe it's the CTO, system architecture sort of guy in me. And I said, well, how big would that have had to be to really cause a problem? We lost 50, 60. We had some long block times for one difficulty adjustment. What might have changed that? And so I envisioned a time in the future where the entire ecosystem, 99% of the ecosystem was captive elephants. And this could be 50 years in the future or 100 years in the future. It's not tomorrow. And I said, well, if that was the case and I wanted to attack Bitcoin, what would I do? And so what I came up with was, here's what I would do. I would, if I'm the US government or maybe a collection of the governments that oversee these sites, and I want to take control, I want to I want to make sure fiat lives and Bitcoin dies. Mm-hmm. I would say, I'm going to wait until a difficulty adjustment occurs. And then I'm going to go into these facilities, and at gunpoint, I'm going to force them to turn it off. So the difficulty adjustment has just happened. We've set the difficulty to give us this about 10-minute block times, and I just shut off 99% of the hash. Now, the 1% is still there, right? There's some rabbits in basements and, chugging away, but they don't have much horsepower. And mathematically, what would happen is we would move to about 18-hour block times. But we're 2,016 blocks away. So if you do that math, what you'll find is that we're like 4 years away from a difficulty adjustment. And we're going to have essentially no throughput that entire period. Now, this is a highly unlikely situation. I'm not here to cause panic. But what I do think is important is that we recognize that we can't let that happen. That the big public miners, which build elephants, have been pushing the hash rate this direction. We're still a long, long way from that happening, okay? And probably in my lifetime, it doesn't happen. But I believe we're trying to make Bitcoin for 1,000 years. This is the money solution for the next 1,000 years. And so what we have to do is we have to think in those terms. We can't think that because something is a low probability, a 0.1% chance of something happening in any given year, that it therefore is not really worth worrying about. because when you apply a 0.1% chance to a 1,000-year period, it becomes a likelihood, right? And so what we have to do is we have to think collectively as a community about what might happen. And I think support the ecosystem, because we don't have a leader, we don't have a central committee. We have to kind of collectively have awareness and not allow this sort of stuff to happen. And so it's a very long-winded way of me saying my promotion of wild horses is in part to prevent this, to make sure that we have plenty of momentum so that there's always enough infrastructure. Because mathematically what I've done is I've gone through it and said, hey, as long as we have at minimum 15% of the infrastructure that's outside the elephants and in this rabbit horse area, we're okay. We'll make it.
Well, it's a lot to digest there. And when we mentioned the China ban. I guess that was 2 years ago now, a little bit over 2 years ago.
A little over 2, yeah.
And at the time, yeah, you mentioned that the hash rate dropped around 60%. I forget what the exact number was, but it was significant enough that it was, if you look at the chart, it's definitely noticeable, the hash rate chart. And it has since more than recovered as we've reached an all-time high now with our network hash rate. But if there is such a black swan event where there is a bunch of miners out there, that bunch of elephants that actually control a great deal of the network, or at least a decent amount, is there enough of that in a centralized jurisdiction like the United States or Canada where this can be done, where they could collectively gather the troops, so to speak, to make this a reality? Because I'm looking at it right now, the Bitcoin network is decentralized enough. Although the majority of the hash rate does lie in the United States and Canada, there's still enough of it around the world, in Kazakhstan, in South America. There's Australia, a whole bunch of other places that do have, a sizable amount. Not a great deal, but it's measurable. So with that, isn't that enough to create some sort of protection to prevent this becoming a reality?
Well, I think we have to be careful with, Len, is when we think that way, we're thinking very present terms. And again, come back to, let's think 1,000 years. So how different was the world politically, the geopolitical structure of the world 1,000 years ago? It was pretty radically different, right? We didn't even have a United States, right?
Bob, I'll even say 10 years ago, it's changed quite a bit.
Yeah. So we really don't know. There's obviously this force that, we don't need to go down this conspiracy rabbit hole, but I mean, there certainly at least is a faction in the world that's globalists, right? Mm-hmm. So in the 1,000-year history, is there a non-zero chance of globalists getting some sort of control? I think they're going to have a hard time. And like I said, the reason I bring this up is not to scare anybody. I am simply saying, these possibilities exist, and they're 100% preventable by simply making sure we have the infrastructure done a certain way. And the wild horses are the key ones, though, because, or even a wild rabbit is really important, because if you generate your own power, then it's really, really hard for them to even find you. I mean, to a certain degree, like how do they even know you're there? It gets pretty difficult. So the answer to your question is, I don't know. I occasionally will talk with some of my friends from Texas that are in the mining circles, and I'll say, because a lot of them, I'm not being critical, but I'm just kind of, again, warning. I'll say, hey guys, you're putting a lot of money and a lot of effort into Texas. I understand why. I understand the value proposition. However, have you considered the possibility, even in the next 10 years, that instead of Greg Abbott being the governor, you have Beto O'Rourke, who was the opponent, who's a pretty liberal Democrat. Mm-hmm. Have you considered the possibility in the same 10-year window that AOC makes a run for the presidency, that she selects Elizabeth Warren as the Secretary of Energy? Now, that's a pretty dystopian world, I think, for most Bitcoiners. But it may not be even those exact people. I'm talking about people from those mindsets, right? And if so, then the US or even Texas may not be a great place to have a mining operation. And so I'm not saying don't go to Texas. In fact, I still continue to explore opportunities there. But I think geographic diversity for your own mining company is very important. And, I expect for instance, in 2024, knock on wood, I expect I'll have some non-US presence in 2024. I need a few things to come together, but I would expect that to happen for my organization, in part because of this, that I feel I have to get some decentralization of the Barefoot footprint, not just the overall one. So, so I don't know if that answers your question or not, and we're all entitled to our opinions.
Absolutely. So in terms of, you're mentioning the wild horses. That's the Goldilocks zone which you're trying to capture with your business, Barefoot Mining. Given the landscape of the economy in the past, say, few months, even last year or two, it's drastically changed for the worse, I would say. I don't think anybody could argue it's gotten any better. And with that being said, is it harder now to find people to want to invest in Bitcoin mining, given what's transpired? Or are they looking at what is happening and maybe that's giving them food for thought, and they're saying, yeah, you know what, maybe this is something I should be investing. So I just want to know, is it getting more challenging in the past little while, or is it getting any easier for you?
No, it's absolutely more challenging. And I'll note, I wrote an article, I think it was a year plus ago, for Bitcoin Magazine on a hypothesis I have, or a theory I have. It's called the miner's trilemma. By the way, also in Bitcoin Magazine, anybody that wants the gory details, there's an article called Satoshi's Heel, which is an article about the 99% hash rate going away and all the mathematics behind that. And that's all described also in an article. If you search my name or you search Satoshi's Heel, you can find that. And then you also find this article I wrote called The Miner's Trilemma. The Miner's Trilemma is this. To bring up a mining site, three things have to come together: energy, mining equipment, and money. And my hypothesis about it is, though, that at any point in time, one of them is always hard. And the moment one that's hard starts becoming easy, it forces a different one to be hard. And we can see that play out this way. So if we look at, let's say, the late 2021 period, even through through all of 2022, what you'll find is that the money was, well, firstly, the first half. So all of 2021, from the mining ban through the first half of 2021, money was very easy. I will go so far as to say, we had to turn money away. People wanted to invest in projects, and we just didn't have anything for them. We unsolicited, right? And then, but the problem we had was we could actually get the energy. The mining equipment was nowhere to be found. And if you could find it, this is those of you who are trying probably remember paying $10,000 for a 96 or 100 terahash per second S19 or something in that class from WhatsMiner or whatever, like Gillis. Now I have a whole rant about why that happened. We can come back to that later if we want. We will stay on your question. So what happened was, we had that. Now, by the middle of 2022, we had the catastrophes with Voyager and Celsius and BlockFi. Bitcoin's price is down. Core Scientific was puking all over itself. We had all this sort of stuff happening. And the prices of the miners started to drift down. They've continued to drift down, by the way. We even today, what's today, the 19th of September? I mean,
20th.
20th? Okay. So we just got I mean, today we just received some price cuts from, I won't say exactly what and from where, but I mean, some material price cuts are still coming in today. The mining equipment is very easy to get. It's very attractively priced, but finding investors for these projects is hard. And the ironic thing is, so we had the shift, right? The mining equipment got easy from hard, and now the money's hard, right?
Yeah.
So that's the trilemma. And so the amazing thing is, though, that this is the very best time to be making investments in mining. Like we can get projects up of reasonable size. Like I said, maybe it's a few hundred kilowatts to a few megawatts. We can go in 60 to 120 days. We can get, depending on the project and location, we can go from the idea to collecting the money to being up and running and distributing Bitcoin to our investors, which is the way we work, by the way. We do not hodl Bitcoin at all. We distribute it to our investors. That's where it should be. Something I fundamentally believe is wrong with the public miners, by the way, is I don't believe they should be hodling. But the
very few are, I think.
Well, a lot of them aren't because they're losing their shirt right now.
Yeah.
But I believe that's an attack vector, and I believe that it's a danger point for us as an industry. But regardless, this is a great time for investment in mining because the value is so good. What I think will happen now, we've been actually pretty successful this year. We'll have we've brought up 3 sites already this year. We'll bring up 2 more that we're completing funding on right now, but we're very confident we have that money. We're going to we have the chance to do 2 more. I don't know whether we can squeeze those in this year or not, but they might bleed into next year. The thing is, if Bitcoin jumps to 45, 50,000, it's going to force the trilemma to start to change, right? So the manufacturers of the equipment have been getting hammered. They're dying to make some extra money, right? After having had phenomenal 2021 and part of 2022, they're dying and they need cash. So they just need some sign of the price recovering, and the prices are going to skyrocket. And so the money will get easy and the equipment's going to get hard again. So the other thing is, if you want to be in mining, you have to get your operation up before the bull run starts. Mm-hmm. Because if you start after the bull run, by the time you're up, especially if you're in a bigger project, by the time you're up, you've missed the bull run. Like you missed the big chance, right? So, and this is going to be a really interesting year, this next year, like what happens to hash. And I just saw a study of, if you look at the public miners, the average cost of production of Bitcoin across like 15 public miners. And I think the best ones are TeraWulf and Riot at about 20,000. Most of them are in the mid to high 20s, so they're kind of flirting with break even right now. And there are several that are, a couple that are above that I don't know how they survive. But with the halving approaching, if we don't see something on the order of a doubling in price, the all-time highs that you've talked about in hash rate at the beginning of the show are gonna we're gonna be looking back up at that mountain because we're gonna lose 30 or 40 or even 50% of the hash rate really quickly on the other side.
Yeah, they'll turn it off. But you mentioned that the producers of the ASICs, they've been hurting for quite some time, and I know Bitmain just released the S19Ks. Now, those aren't anything particularly special, but the S21, which has been announced, I don't know if it has been released to the wild yet. It's not a revolutionary one. It's more of an evolutionary step, but it's going to make things a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient for large-scale miners to really deploy them and make things a little bit easier for them to hash out, even when the price goes up. But even with that, with the release of the S21s, that halving that's coming up in April next year, it's April 20th, as you estimated earlier in the show. That's the biggest problem that I guess these miners are dealing with, is because even if the price doubles, the hash rate is probably going to go up significantly between now and April next year. So the price not only has to double, it has to go beyond doubling. Plus, the value of the US dollar will be somewhat less in April of this next year compared to this what it is right now. How much less it's going to be, it's anybody's guess. So that has to also be computed in the equation. So that price of Bitcoin's got to go up much more. No, I would say much more, but it's double, but plus something else. And that's just to break even to today's dollar, today's hashing. And they have to then scale this out moving forward as things progress, as the price of Bitcoin goes choppy. Well, so much to take into consideration. I feel bad for these miners because they are in a tough position to continue doing business.
Well, I don't feel bad for them, not from a competitive standpoint, but to be honest, they created this problem to a great degree. And I'm somewhat of a lone wolf saying what I'm going to say, and I respect anybody that wishes to disagree with me, but I'll go back to the Core Scientific situation, which I mentioned earlier, them in the same breath as BlockFi and Celsius and Voyager. I did that for a reason. I find it fascinating that as a collective community, we do not place Core Scientific in the same breath as these other companies, because they created a massive amount of damage to the Bitcoin ecosystem beyond the fact that they went bankrupt. Like, I mean, that's obvious, right? They went bankrupt. Sorry for their shareholders, but they did massive damage. I'll give you just a few highlights. They were doing about 200 million in revenue when they went public in January of 2022, not that long ago. So they raised $200 million in their IPO. They proceeded. They had. Forgive me if I'm off slightly. They had, I don't know, maybe $100 million of debt at the time. Over the next 11 months, they pushed that debt level to $1 billion.
They 10x'd it.
And they were bankrupt by December. And they lost. They had something on the order of 2,000 Bitcoin at the time they started the IPO. They were mining 1,000 a month, and they blew all that too. They blew the 200 million in the IPO. They couldn't service their debt. They took that $1 billion and they played a massive role in the trilemma thing I talked about before. They were buying everything in sight. And, you know, I'll be very specific about it. It was greed and fiat mentality and all the things I think Bitcoiners should hate. They hurt companies like mine who were trying to expand and had viable places and couldn't get equipment at reasonable prices. I survived. A whole bunch of companies didn't. A whole bunch of plebs who probably wanted to have a machine in their house or, you know, be part of the mining network and be a rabbit were prevented from that opportunity. And honestly, you can directly blame them for that. Additionally, their dumping of all that Bitcoin over that time period played a massive role in the bear market and suppressing Bitcoin through all of 2022. Because they were dumping about on average about 1,500 to 2,000 Bitcoin per month, just dumping into this system. And on top of it, they took all that debt, that $1 billion of debt, and they didn't hedge it at all. They had bet 100% on Bitcoin going up in price. And by the way, all that equipment they were buying, they didn't know where they were going to plug it in. They had no infrastructure plans and capability to execute, which tells you either it was complete operational misconduct, or it was greed and trying to corner the market on those machines and hoping to sell them back to other people later at a big profit. And they got caught with their pants down. Some of the other public miners had some of the same behaviors, but not to the same degree. And, you know, they lived. So part of my angst that I'm sure you can detect for this is, you know, they hurt me, they hurt my company, they hurt my investors, but they hurt Bitcoin. And I believe very strongly, I'm going to do some special content on this soon, but I believe very strongly that if you are a company who is a guardian of the base layer, that's what I believe I am. I am part of the guardian of the base layer, that I need to operate my company within the ethos of Bitcoin. Above all else, you know, so if you're a miner, if you're a mining pool, if you're a somebody on the a core developer, like personally and for whatever organization you represent, you need to withhold the integrity of the ethos of Bitcoin in everything that you do. And I think the community should hold us to those standards as well. That if any of us doing this step out of line, then they should lambast us. And they've been pretty good at doing that to exchanges and things like that. But for some reason, they have not gone after and vilified the miners that do this.
Some people have, especially ones that have operated with not the best intention of Bitcoin in mind. For example, Luxor, and that's a mining pool. Marathon is another one that tends to get a lot of bad press from hardcore Bitcoiners. So they're not totally unscathed, but there are a couple, and I just want to bring them up and see your thoughts on them, that tend to share a lot of the same ideas than do Bitcoiners, and dare I say even hardcore Bitcoiners. And one would be Cathedra Bitcoin, and a second would be, I think it's called Giga Energies. I forget the exact. It's a couple of gentlemen that operate out of Texas, and we've had officials from both of those companies on their show, and absolutely love them. Like, they're good guys. Each of the companies. Like, I don't want to know your thoughts. Like, have you interacted with them in any way?
I don't know Cathedra, but I know the Giga folks pretty well, and I applaud them. Matt, who's the CEO, and I've met with. I know him personally. He's a good dude. He's doing the right things. I would work with Matt and his team anytime on a project because I know that they're doing it the right way, and so absolutely. And I don't know. I've heard of Cathedra, but I don't know anybody there, so it wouldn't be proper for me to comment on it. But if they've been on your show and you like them, then I'll definitely believe it. But I think you know, if we look, I can speak to Giga and I can speak to Barefoot. I think a lot of us in this kind of area, and I will extend it to, Steve Barber is a friend of mine at Upstream. He's providing, equipment, a Canadian cohort of yours.
He's been on our show too.
Yeah, Steve's a great dude, and he's a friend of mine. I think there are several of us, but they tend to be more the privately held companies, and all of us in our own way are horses, whether it's Matt's company or my company or Cathedra. We're kind of the horses of the ecosystem. And I outside of core, I don't want to blast anybody on this show, but theirs is just so vile that I feel compelled to publicly vilify them. But
channel the old man yell stuff. We got to do that on the show. Channel that. Yeah. Let's talk about more core scientific so we can really get you agitated.
Yeah. I mean, it just pisses me off because it is everything Bitcoin isn't. When you go study that, it is just everything that Bitcoin is not. And what really pisses me off is, they're trying to come out of bankruptcy. And I'll say this, to your audience. I mean, everybody do your own self-reflection. I'm not telling anybody what to do. But when you buy the stock of companies like that, understand that you are supporting them. That you might look at it as an investment, but it is also an endorsement of what they're doing. And so to each their own. It's not for me to tell you what to do, but if you're a Bitcoiner, I challenge you to think about your conscience, think about what you're trying to accomplish, and ask whether or not deploying your money into Core or if it's one of the other public miners, go do your due diligence. I'll also say that an investment in a public mining company, contrary to what some people say, is not a proxy for an investment in Bitcoin. It is a fiat investment. None of them pay dividends. You're basically, you're betting on a management team to execute on a plan. I had a little exchange. We mentioned Steve earlier today, and we had a little tweet exchange earlier today, basically saying, we wish we could, again, I'm not picking individual ones, but holistically kind of bet against the public miners because they are so grossly overvalued right now. But the problem is you can't expect the market to react rationally. And I think a lot of people from the outside do look at them as proxies for Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin goes from 25 to 35, a lot of them think that then the miners the public mining companies become an attractive investment option.
Yeah, especially if things go rosy with respect to the price of Bitcoin, it's going to be a very attractive option for a lot of people because the stock market, although it's doing okay in some regards, typically when the price of Bitcoin goes on a run, those stocks, the stock price for those miners, they go on an absolute tear at the same time. But again, it's all fiat money, and it's not owning Bitcoin, you're owning the company, and you're right. You're reflecting, and you're giving them. You're saying we're okay with your management decisions. We're okay with your ideas and your principles, and we're going to give you money to go ahead and continue doing what you're doing. Sometimes if it's wrong, like Core Scientific did, giving them money is obviously the wrong thing because it impacts, as you mentioned, a great many people in the Bitcoin community that is doing, I would say, a decent thing by trying to secure the network. And if it's harder to do business to secure the network and hash away, it jeopardizes the security of Bitcoin to a degree. I have one question that Boom Dust, and Boom Dust is a huge fan of yours, by the way. Just want to make point that out. He was asking, I'm not sure if you could answer this. When Barefoot mines Bitcoin, do you ever sell? Is it sold directly to an exchange, or is there any private sales that are available for people to get Virgin Bitcoin? And you don't have to answer that. I'm just curious to know what's the strategies here.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'll answer it. So we do sell because we have operating costs. I mean, we have to pay our employees, and we have to pay an electric bill, and we have to, at least for our captive side. So yes, we sell. But then we don't hodl what's left though. So the profit we distribute to our investors, and we do that every month.
And does it go straight to an exchange? Do you deal with one particular exchange? Are you able to disclose this information, or is it something you want to hold close to your vest?
We deal with several exchanges. So
Gotcha.
There's a chain of custody. Okay. So what we do is, this is more than the question, but you can cut me off. I'm not offended.
Go downhill.
Okay. So what we do is, at any point in time, we have several sites, right? And so we always are operating in at least 3 pools. So we do not rely on a single pool. We always have 3. And we will typically kick one out on occasion, right? So we every week we do an internal review. We have a certain set of systems that are in the same container, the same firewall, exactly the same unit, the same firmware, the same everything, right? And what we do is we have typically 10 units in that container, 10 units all the same, of 10 units on pool A, pool B, and pool C. Then we let them run for the week. We sit down at the end of the week and we review the performance, the actual output from those. Then if we see something material, like there's a much bigger difference than probably people expect. Like we can see differences sometimes of 12 to 15% between the best one and the worst one on a given week. That's
significant.
It's a big deal. And it's why we have this like scientific control over it. Like, because, we don't want any sort of difference, whether it be network latency or, whatever. Like these are identical units. Everything is exactly the same. And 10 is a big enough number that any small variance from unit to unit gets pulled out. Okay. So, on occasion, if we see one that trails too much, we'll kick them out and we'll give another pool a chance. Okay. And then we'll distribute the hash amongst those 3 for the coming week. It tends to not change, honestly, over very much from week to week. But like when one starts to lag, we'll kick them out and then we'll distribute some of the hash. Okay. So then typically we sell once or twice per month to cover operating expenses. In answer to the question, I am open to private transactions.
Very nice. Okay. Good to know. So, I guess they could reach you directly if they want to, or
if somebody's interested in that, and especially, we can have a private conversation. I don't mean any offense. I don't want to sell 10,000 sats to somebody.
No, it's not worth your while to do that. It's good in bulk, obviously.
But if somebody has a consistent need, and by the way, I think these deals are going to become very common, and because for all kinds of reasons, right? Some of them are KYC oriented, and some of them are relating to price because we're cutting out a middleman, and so there's a variety of different reasons why I think this will happen. But I also think, on a bit of a tangent, I think what will happen is in the future, companies or organizations that need, let's say, a guaranteed amount of liquidity every month, I think they'd be like. I'll give you an example. I think this is okay for me to say. So my friends at Jolts, if you're familiar with Jolts,
I've heard of them.
Okay, so it's a Bitcoin rewards program.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so full disclosure, I have an investment in them. I run a small fund, and I have an investment in them, and they have invested back in one of our mining operations. Okay, so why is that relationship important? Well, it's in large part because what we can do is we can guarantee to them a certain amount of liquidity. Okay, they don't have to depend on a third party, and right now that may seem trivial. You go, well, Bitcoin fees are low, and I can go to an exchange and I can buy it at any point in time. But again, put on a hat with a longer term horizon. If you're a business and you have to provide an assurance that you can provide your customers or you have liquidity needs within your business cycle and you can't get access to Bitcoin, you're screwed. So I think direct relationships between miners and organizations that need liquidity will become very important, and they'll cut out the exchanges and some of the trading desks and things like that in the future, because of that. So did that answer the question? I have a tendency to go all over the place.
No, you did a really good job. And we've been at this for an hour. I'm not sure if you have some time for more questions.
Because I'm not sure. I mean, as long as you think people will listen, we can talk. So
awesome. No, I definitely have a few more questions to ask. So I'll ask you about the custom firmware that you guys employ in your miners. Do you have anyone in particular that you like to use, or just anything that fits that particular miner best?
Well, we're very, very conservative with it, honestly. So I won't say specific names. We always start out with stock. Like you mentioned, by the way, you mentioned the S19K. By the way, I think that's a great unit, by the way. I'm not saying it's like setting the world on fire, but I think it's fantastic. It is a workhorse product, and an investment in it right now, I think, is going to be fantastic through the halving and, as part of the next cycle. We're seeing these, and a great value. So just, for those out there, and anybody that wants to buy, we will sell and host for people. It's not our main thrust, but we do offer that service, and we'll just help people buy too. If somebody wants one, you can reach out to us. But that's a great one. We can get them essentially instantly at a great price. I'm going off the top of my head, 24 joules per terahash, which is very solid. It's not 18 or something like.
The only thing that's 18, I think, is the something that's hydro or like immersed, right?
So yeah, so it brings up an interesting point. So I'm a computer designer, so that's my DNA, right? And so I'm the CEO and founder of the company, but the president of the company, Keith Thomas, he's also an old engineer. He was the head of desktop engineering at Gateway. So between us, we've designed hundreds of computers, and we've sold hundreds of millions of computers that we've designed have been in the market. So we are extremely conservative with things. Like, we think a lot of companies make a lot of mistakes, and a lot of individuals make a lot of mistakes pushing overclocking too hard. Like, it is, I'll just tell you without going down that rabbit hole too hard, be very careful, folks. You are, know what you're doing. Don't think that because you got it working for a little while that it's going to be stable in the long run, and if you want to push it 1% or 2%, single digit percentage, maybe, okay. But you start pushing it harder than that, let me just say, you're asking for trouble. You're probably going to damage the equipment. And by the way, you are pushing the machine into less efficiency. So if you have capacity, so the way I look at it is we maximize our capacity. If you give me a site, I'm going to maximize the amount of energy as many machines as I can support, and their highest reasonable efficiency level. That's what I'm going to put in there. So I'm not going to overclock because I've already maxed my energy out, right? So overclocking only makes sense if you have a little bit of extra energy. And even then, my generic advice is don't push it. Like,
buy more equipment and plug it in.
Buy more equipment and plug it in. Yeah. So we'll keep it simple, right?
Yeah.
So where were we, Len? I'm sorry.
Man. Well, you were talking about don't overclock. That what you were just.
Yeah. Don't push it hard. Don't push it hard. Yeah.
Yeah. There was even a tweet thread, I think, that you have today. It shows some of the damage that can be potentially the outcome of overclocking to some frayed wiring, or because you're running more power through wiring that may not be designed for that.
Well, yeah, because what happens is, when you do that, you start pushing the amperage up, right? Yeah. And so the wiring and the circuits and all that infrastructure may not be designed for it. Like, and so that wasn't one of our sites. That was somebody else's site that had a complete blowout. And this is dangerous stuff, by the way, too. I mean, don't.
It's a fire hazard.
Yeah, and it's a lot of electricity, and people can get hurt badly, and people can die. And so, if you don't know what you're doing, just stay in the rails that you know and are confident in, and don't mess with that. And by the way, like I said earlier, you want some extra throughput? Go play around, go experiment with some pools, because maybe you can eke out another 5% by finding a pool that works for you better.
Yeah, agreed. That could be another way around it. Question, and this is something I'm not sure if you're able to answer it, but a little while ago, Intel announced they're going to get into the mining game. Then shortly thereafter, they decided to bail out of the mining game for a variety of reasons. Did you ever get your hands on one of those units? And I know that some people did, but they are, I guess, NDAs prevent them from actually talking about it too much. So I'll leave that to you. You may have to sidestep this question due to legalities.
I am under NDA.
That's enough. We'll leave it at that.
But there is something I can tell you, which it doesn't break the NDA. I do have one, and we are running one, and it's okay. What I'll also say about Intel is, my relationship with Intel goes back almost 40 years. I really hope they get in the game. The fact that I'm under NDA probably tells you something to begin with, but read between those lines for what it's worth. But we need more choices. I have decent relationships with Bitmain and MicroBT, and we need more choices at the silicon level, not just the system level.
Agreed. And people watching and listening to this are going to kick me, but I'm not going to talk about Intel anymore because I don't want to put you in a position that would be uncomfortable or would cause any harm to you in one way or shape or form. So we'll just sidestep this altogether. Thoughts on the HVAC industry, the integration of ASICs built into systems? I know we have talked to one person that I met. We met, Canada Extreme, I think, and he was experimenting with that. Have you delved in that? Have you heard about that? Or I know this may be more prominent in the northern states or even in Canada, but opportunities exist. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's important. We talked about the rabbits before, right? And I think this is the path for the rabbits. And we have some thoughts and plans of our own. We've dabbled. We haven't commercialized anything. I know there are people that are doing things like, for instance, space heaters and things like that. There are individual plebs who have made pool heaters and things like that. I love it. I think it's fantastic. I'll go back to what we just talked about. Right now, it's difficult to develop these products because we don't have somebody we can just go buy silicon from. So a lot of the people that are doing this, and I applaud them. I love ingenuity and I applaud anybody trying it. But what they're basically often doing is they're recycling silicon from, they might take an old S9 or S17 or something like that, and they'll pull a board or pull some chips and, repurpose them. And that's all wonderful. I think that's great. It is not scalable. You can't make a massive business that impacts the world recycling that sort of stuff. It just technically is not going to work. What you need somebody to sell you the silicon new, in spec, and then these products then that enables creativity at a massive level. We have several ideas about what we could do. But we need that. We need that. Just like the personal computer, right? The personal computer, you know, we had Intel and AMD, and some of you may not know that back in like the 80s, there was Harris Semiconductor and Chips and
Cyrix.
Technologies, and there was a whole bunch of other people who also had licenses to make Intel chips. And I did some work with some of those companies, but it fostered massive creativity, mobile computing, tablet computing, obviously all kinds of, you know, desktops and all that other stuff. And we had an explosion of creativity in the personal computer market for 20 years that came from Gateway and Dell and HP and Toshiba and, you know, these sort of companies. We need that same thing in the Bitcoin world. We need silicon and then system creators.
100%. Now, we're getting a little bit long in time here, so I'm going to just ask you one quick question, and then we could sign off, because I want to bring you back on to talk about something I wanted to talk about today, which is the block space, and the fact that this is a topic that we go deep on, and I don't think we would do justice by just brushing over it or just glossing over this topic. So we'll bring you back to discuss this further. Behind you is a picture. I see Donald Duck. Yeah. I see. Is it Donald or Scrooge McDuck? Scrooge
McDuck. And
describe it for the listeners who are not going to be able to see this, just in case. I see Scrooge McDuck. He's holding looks like a coin that has the Bitcoin symbol in it.
Correct. Yeah.
On the right side, it looks like a picture, somebody from The Simpsons.
Simpsons laser-eyed. Yep.
Very nice.
And that's my wife right there. If you see the person in the middle going with her hands up, there's my wife.
I encourage everybody out there that is listening to this, just take a peek at what it looks like. Go onto our YouTube channel, just watch a few minutes of it, and you'll see what I mean. It's an awesome picture. I'm assuming that's a TV that you have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's a good idea. Very cool.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I know we've run really long, but
no, go ahead.
So that picture, that's my wife in the picture, and she's a Bitcoiner. A little story about her as well, but that's from Bitcoin 2021 in Miami, and I believe, you know, that was a seminal event in the history of Bitcoin. Very, very important thing. You know, first, for those of you who don't know, in the midst of COVID, it was the first major conference of any sort held anywhere in the world. I'm not talking just Bitcoin. I'm just saying, like, the Bitcoiners were like, F this. And, you know, we held an event with 12,000 people in Miami. It was a thrilling place to be. There's a district in Miami called the Wynwood District, and it's known for its art. And they had some artists come in and make these massive murals on the walls surrounding the event center. And that photo is there from that. What I'll also tell you is that photo at a personal level happened right after, like 10 minutes after, Jack Mallers was on stage announcing the El Salvador adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender, right? That it was, you know, that they were doing it. The emotion that surrounded that whole thing, you know, I still have goosebumps today from the collective vibe of that happening. It was a big part of my wife's journey, and she was already a Bitcoiner, but it was like, boom, it solidified something for her. I ended up, just as a side note, the next day after that announcement, which was the end of the conference ended with that. I got a call from the El Salvadorian, or not a call, I got a DM actually from the El Salvadorian embassy in Washington, D.C., and they asked me to come up the next day. So the day after that, I flew to Washington, D.C., and I got to meet with Ambassador Mayorga and her whole staff. And they were they were at that point, Bitcoin, they didn't know much about it. And I was really honored that they asked me to come up there and just spend a day with them and talk to them about Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining and educate them. And then I got invited to El Salvador a few weeks later. My wife and I went there to be part of that. So as great as that picture is, the symbolism of that picture to me is even bigger, because it embodies like everything that we're trying to accomplish. And there's so much emotion around it.
Yeah, to put it into context, I totally forgot about the fact that that was the first big event that took place after the COVID shutdown, and it was, you know, celebrated as a result of what happened. And you're right. Bukele came out and talked about El Salvador was their Bitcoin adoption, which took place around 6 months later. I think it was the day after Labor Day or Labor Day of that year. I forget what it was. So
about
yeah,
3 months later, but yes.
So yeah, put it into context. It was an incredible time. Have you been to El Salvador since?
Yeah, then
And
we
if
got
so,
invited back.
Have things changed like noticeably in your eyes?
Yeah,
Yeah, for the better.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's phenomenal. Because of my career and what I did in my career, I was blessed to be able to travel all over the world.
Uh-huh.
And I've seen countries in decline and I've seen countries on the rise. And there's a certain thing that you can see. If you haven't traveled, I really encourage you to travel. Anybody out there, really, really get out there and see the world and go to places you never imagined you would go. But one of the first things I think you can notice when you go to a country is there a sense of order? Are the people happy? Like you can see these things that make a huge difference. So my wife, who's in that picture, she's from the Philippines originally. And, the Philippines is a country that continually struggles. And like she has this saying when we're in the Philippines, and the saying is like, if we're driving, she'll always remind me, say, hey, remember, there are no rules, traffic rules in the Philippines. There are only suggestions. So, meaning a stop sign, it's a maybe. A red light, it's a maybe. A one-way sign, it's a maybe. It's use your discretion. El Salvador is not like that. El Salvador is a country that is run well, but it's not oppressed. The people are happy. Things work. They have their shit together, and I'm extremely impressed. And I would encourage Bitcoiners to go out there and experience it for themselves. It's very cool to be at Bitcoin Beach and buy a bracelet or a mango from a street vendor and use Lightning to do it. Mm-hmm. Those are things that, you can do. Now, when you go into San Salvador in the main city, like the Bitcoin adoption, it's still lagging. It's, it's there sometimes, it's not there sometimes. But Bitcoin has played a massive role in the modernization and the maturation of that country. So yes, and I think that's the hope, like even in the Philippines, there's a very strong Bitcoin movement. My wife and I are probably going back there, and there's some people there trying to do some great things. We're hoping to meet with some of those people. Hope to do some evangelism ourselves while we're there. But I'm very, very optimistic. I believe Bitcoin rises from places like that. It's hard. You're in Canada. I'm in the US. We have all kinds of problems, but the reality is it's often very hard for people in first world situations to see the need. But go there, and the people get it.
Well said, Bob. I want to thank you, and I apologize for having you come on a little bit longer than the hour slot we had originally booked. I'm not sure if this impacts the rest of your day. I'm going to just hand it off to you. And where could people find you if they have any questions? I mean, and you could talk about whatever you want for the next little bit. The floor is yours, and then we could close it off from there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I thank you for having me, Len. And I could care. I mean, I you know, you can have me as long as you want. Happy to come back because we didn't talk about block space and all that. But so my main thrust is with Barefoot Mining. If you're a pleb out there and you know you want to buy a few systems and you want them hosted, we do that. Reach out to us. If you're an investor and you've wanted to own part of a Bitcoin company that pays in Bitcoin on a regular basis and you want to be an owner in something like that, we offer that as well. Just reach out to us through barefootmining.com. There's a investor section or contact section in the website. There's also a learn area, by the way, if you want to hear me rant more than tonight. There's a whole shitload of places you can see a whole bunch of our content. You mentioned my Old Man Yells, which is me doing kind of some monologues on various technology and Bitcoin related topics. You can find me on Twitter at boomer_BTC. I'm there every day. My DMs are open, and you know, if you have a question, I do my best to answer questions, or if somebody wants to offer an alternative opinion, I certainly respect everybody's opinions. And you know, the last thing I'll say is, you know, live the ethos. You know, if you're here listening to this show, you're probably a Bitcoiner, and so you know, just think about what you do and the moves you make. I'll go back to, you know, owning public mining stocks, but that's not the only thing. You know, just, you know, believe in something. But, you know, I believe we're fighting for the most important thing in the world, which is, you know, the monetary system. I don't believe we fix anything materially in the world until we fix the money, whether that's social justice issues or wealth disparity or poverty or, you know, whatever. Until we fix the money, it's just political games. So, you know, be part of it in some way if you can, but at a minimum where you make your investments and you put your money and you put your time, you know, support those people that are here for the right reasons.
Treat the cause, not the symptom. That's what we're trying to do here. And yeah, I want to thank you so much for coming on our show. We're going to book you again for another appearance in the very near future, because I do want to talk about the mempool being full and everything. So Bob, thank you for coming on our show. For people listening and watching and still here, thank you so much. Joey's going to be doing an interview tomorrow night with Ryan Griggs, so check that out. We'll start at 7. So with that, take care, and thanks so much, Bob, for coming on the show.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Len.